It's good to see so many people joining us this afternoon for the launch of our 2025 annual report on serious further offences. I'm just going to provide some context ahead of us talking about the contents of our report. So this is the opportunity to hear from our team about the findings this year. And to place it in context, the probation service is currently managing a caseload somewhere in the region of 244,000 cases. Now, serious further offences committed by people under the supervision or recently under the supervision of the probation service are overall very rare. But of course, they need to be treated seriously when they occur to ensure that we can identify learning where possible and to ensure that we provide victims with an account of what may have happened and ensure that they get closure wherever possible. Now, whilst SFOs are rare, they have been increasing over the last 2 to 3 years, and it's important that we look at that trend line to understand what is happening. I would venture to say that the increase in serious further offences is certainly linked to the huge pressure currently being placed on our probation service as a result of the significant staffing challenges and the issues they face at the front line. In this year's annual report, we also provide an opportunity to hear from victims of serious further offences of their experience of the system. And I think there's real learning for the system that will come from that. So just to talk through the team that we hear, we've got our serious further offences team. We've got Faith Geary, the new Chief Operating Officer of the Inspectorate, and Simi, who's head of our probation inspection programme. Could I have the next slide, please? So our vision at the Inspectorate is to provide a high quality inspection and to shine a light on the services that are provided. And we're expecting through that to seek to improve the quality of practice, but also provide an honest view in relation to what the practice is on the ground, which can sometimes be different to obviously what people are expecting given the pressures that we're facing. So I'm going to pass over, I think, to Simi to talk through the background, and then we'll hear from the team, and there should be plenty of time at the conclusion of our presentation to ask questions. Over to you, Simi.
Thank you, Martin. So a little bit of background before we go into the report itself. Today we're focusing on the work of the serious further offences team, as Martin mentioned. Serious further offences are specific violent and sexual offences committed by people who are or who have very recently been under the supervision of the probation service at the time of the offence itself. Over the last 2 years, what we have seen is that there's been a sustained increase in the number of serious further offence notifications, and we hope from the work that we're undertaking, our oversight and events like this, that we are able to share some useful learning where that is relevant. And in terms of the SFO process, so if we can have the next slide. Okay, thank you. The SFO process is triggered when a person on probation has been charged with a qualifying offence when they appear in court. The purpose of the review is to provide assurance that there has been a rigorous review undertaken and scrutiny of practice and identify any relevant learnings, and that's aimed at all levels. We examine a rate of approximately 20% of all SFO reviews to drive improvement and increase public confidence in the quality. The remaining reviews are then conducted by HMPPS. Now, this is our 4th annual report. It sets out the findings of our quality assurance work around from April 2024 through to April 2025. It also includes an overview of our engagement with the SFOs, victims, families as well. I'll hand over to Lizzie, who will now take us through the report findings. Thanks, Lizzie.
Thanks, Simi. Morning, everybody. So we're going to talk then today about the report and give you an overview of what's contained in the report and what our findings have been from the last year. So firstly, we're going to look through our quality assurance findings and highlight trends within that and within the standards that we rate against. Then we're going to look at the themes that have come out from our engagement with victims' families. As Martin mentioned at the beginning, this year we've had an opportunity to speak to the families of those that have been involved with SFOs, and there's some really insightful reflections from them coming up a bit later. And then finally, we will consider the recommendations that this year's report has made, and I'll go through those at the end. So I'm going to hand over now to Hannah, who's going to talk you through the findings from the quality assurance.
Thanks, Lizzie. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Williams, one of the SFO inspectors. So I'm going to talk you through the next few slides on our quality assurance findings. So between April 2024 and April 2025, we quality assured 90 SFO reviews. So our findings have consistently shown that improvements are needed, both in respect of the quality of the reviews and their timeliness. So this diagram shows the composite ratings given to the 90 SFO reviews that we quality assured. So of those 90 reviews, 53% were rated as requires improvement, 46% as good and 1% as outstanding. And compared to our previous year's findings, this shows that there have not been improvements in the proportion of reviews meeting the required standard. So the next few slides break down the individual standards. So this is for analysis of practice. The analysis of practice standard requires a transparent analysis of the assessing, planning, implementation and reviewing practice. The SFO review should be investigative in its approach and analyse whether all reasonable action was taken across all levels in the organisation. The underpinning reasons for the omissions in practice should also be explored and explained, and where relevant, effective practice should also be identified. So this year we saw improvements in the proportion of SFO reviews that had analysed practice to a good or outstanding standard, with 63% meeting the standard compared with 56% in the previous year. So this is a positive upward trend. Okay, so the next one is sufficient judgments. This considers whether the review has clear, balanced and evidence-based judgments on the sufficiency of practice. It looks at whether the review has been explorative and investigative, whether there are judgments on systemic and procedural factors which underpin the practice, and whether there are judgments on management oversight at all levels and on probation's contribution to partnership working where relevant. So this year we've seen a slight decrease in the sufficient judgment ratings from last year. So this year it was 44% were rated as good as or outstanding compared to 47% in the previous year. So moving on to learning. So the learning standard considers if all relevant learning is identified and whether this learning is then translated into developmental actions. The action plans should address practice deficits at all levels where relevant, and actions should be smart and clear about how the impact of that action is going to be measured. It also considers whether there's been effective countersigning of the review by the probation region to ensure that all learning opportunities have been identified. So under this standard, we saw a slight increase in the number of reviews that met this standard, with 47% rated good or outstanding compared to 44% in the previous year, excuse me. And the final standard then is victims and their families. So this standard considers whether the review is accessible and inclusive, whether it's sensitive and transparent and provides balanced judgments focusing on pertinent issues which are likely to most likely be of concern. The review should provide assurance that all required learning has been identified and translated into tangible actions. So in terms of this standard, it had the lowest proportion of SFO reviews that met the required standard, with 60% rated as requires improvement and 40% rated as good. So this raises concern about the lack of focus given to this standard and the impact it does have on the overall quality of the SFO review. And later, as we've mentioned, we'll be sharing our findings from our engagement with victims and their families. So I'll now hand back over to Lizzie, who's going to talk you through some action planning findings.
Thank you. So this year we've been looking at action plans, which, as has been mentioned, there is an action plan created following the completion of an SFO review, which seeks to set out the learning that should take place for individuals, teams and wider systemic issues that have been addressed in the review. So following the creation of the action plan, this is then implemented by the region, and the region are required to provide an update after 6 months to show where there's been learning and what the impact of that has been. So over the last year, we've been undertaking dip sampling of action plans, and we've aimed to look at a review from every region in the probation service. And this is for us to see how effective the action plans are and what the impact has been of the learning that has been implemented. What we found when we've looked at those action plans is that the quality of these have varied So some have demonstrated that action has been taken forward effectively, whereas some, what we've found, is it's not clear what the impact of that action has been. So, for example, in some action plans, we've seen that conversations have taken place and there's been an assurance put in the action plan that the activity has been taken forward, but it's not clear how well that's been embedded and how it's been considered in ongoing practice after the plan has been completed. It is not always clear, therefore, what the impact of learning is, and this is really important to identify, given that there are usually several elements of learning that need to be taken forward. So as the quality of action planning has varied quite significantly, we have made a recommendation, which I'll come on to at the end, which is for the probation service to consider how they implement action planning and identify an update on learning as and when that takes place. And I'll now hand over to Lindsay to talk about the victims' families' input. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie. Hello, everyone. I'm Lindsay Whittam. I'm also an SFO inspector. And as Lizzie said, I'd like to talk to you about the voice of victims' families. So in order for us to understand how SFO victims and their families experience the SFO review process, this year we gathered feedback from the families of victims impacted by an SFO, and we did that both through a survey that was distributed via support charities, as well as in-person meetings with families who had reached out to us directly. And from this engagement, we fully recognise that whilst it may be impossible to ever remedy the harm and trauma caused by an SFO, that the voice of the victim and their family is critical in shaping victim-focused practice and ensuring that the review process is transparent, compassionate, and focused on learning and accountability at the correct level. What we heard from families is a stark reminder of the profound human impact of an SFO and the way the review process is experienced, which for many raised serious concerns. Poor communication, lack of transparency, and a perceived absence of humanisation of the victim and compassion for their families were all highlighted as critical elements. Families reported that engagement with the probation service was often limited to delayed and formal interactions that failed to acknowledge the gravity of their loss. We heard that families at times had had to chase for information that they later learned that they were actually entitled to, and recollections indicated shared concerns about untimely communication, insufficient support, and a perception of defensive local engagement, as outlined in these example quotes. Delays in receiving reviews also further compounded the family's grief and reinforced their sense of being disregarded. A commonly raised concern was that the process was disjointed and incomplete, and that disclosure meetings were perceived as a procedural formality rather than an opportunity for meaningful and victim-focused engagement. A recurring theme was the need for personalised engagement. Families stressed that victims should not be treated purely as case numbers or be peripheral to the main narrative. There was also strong emphasis on the impact of language that is used in reviews, with terms such as the murder or the SFO being experienced as dehumanising of their loved one and distressing. The testimonies of those that had received disclosure of the SFO review revealed that compassionate and reassuring experiences were rare, and that in contrast, a common experience was to feel misunderstood, dismissed, and unsupported throughout their interactions with the service. In terms of the review itself, families wanted clear, concise explanations of what had happened, the failures that had occurred, and the learning that had been identified as necessary to prevent recurrence. Families also told us that factual inaccuracies significantly undermined their confidence in reviews. There was also a strong desire for the review to be accompanied by a sincere apology as a simple but as a powerful act of organisational accountability. We'd encourage you to read our annual report, to read all of the powerful testimonies of the families who have engaged with us. But we'd just like to conclude this section by sharing just a few of those now.
The SFO review revealed mistakes far beyond our expectations. It felt like losing Amy all over again. The probation service had no appreciation of the risks posed by the driver who killed her, despite the fact he was driving illegally while on licence. They took no steps to stop him. This led directly to Amy's death and to the lives of all who loved her being shattered forever. We need to see this culture of indifference to road crime challenged and the danger it poses recognised.
Trying to navigate life without Amy feels impossible. The probation service made a multitude of mistakes in the lead up to her being killed, and we were then handed an SFO review that was confusing, impersonal, and offered no clear explanation or apology. Seeing your loved one's traumatic death referred to as the SFO is cold, distressing, and reduced Amy's death to a paperwork exercise. How can we expect improvements to be taken seriously when those who need to learn don't even know the person's name?
When we received the SFO report, the first thing we noticed was a mistake in the first line. They had gotten my son's date of death wrong. This was so upsetting and immediately made us feel that work wasn't a priority for them. The report then showed that 29 mistakes had been made in the handling of the case, but they didn't take responsibility. It felt like they weren't really bothered by the impact on us and our family.
On behalf of the victims' families represented by Voice, it must be stated that they have already endured the unimaginable and catastrophic murder of a loved one. The repercussions of such loss are lifelong, and in truth, it is the families who are serving the only real life sentence. Their journey to obtain full disclosure of serious further offence reviews has been distressing, traumatic, and unnecessarily difficult. SFO reports are notoriously hard to access, with many families waiting years without full disclosure. This is totally unacceptable and unforgivable. Too often, families are not informed of the existence of an SFO, nor given the clarity about its contents. They are ignored, denied timely disclosure, and excluded from meaningful opportunities to discuss the relevance. The lack of sensitivity and compassion shown in the initial stages causes profound distress and trauma. Families deserve openness, respect, and accountability. Anything less perpetuates harm and re-traumatises those already suffering.
Okay, thank you for listening to those powerful testimonies. I'm now going to hand over to Lizzie, who will explain how that engagement has also helped shape our recommendations this year.
Thanks, Lindsay. So this year, we've made 7 recommendations following the completion of our report to HMPPS, and 4 of those focus on the quality and timeliness of SFO reviews, as outlined by Hannah earlier, and on addressing the backlog of overdue reviews. And 3 recommendations are specifically aimed at improving the experiences of victims and their families based on the input that you've just received from Lindsay. So here are the recommendations. So as you'll see, the first 3 here are regarding victims and their families. And so we're asking that the Probation Service HMPPS devise and implement an approach to engaging with victims and their families throughout the SFO process. Sorry, Luke, can I just go back to the one before? Thank you. Which is directly informed throughout by victims, their families and relevant interested parties. To devise and implement a clear mechanism by which feedback from victims and their families can be collected, understood and acted on following the sharing of an SFO review, and to carry out a review of the support and training provided to staff that deliver SFO findings to victims and their families, and act on the findings of that review. And as I've mentioned, the following recommendations are regarding the SFO review process. So the fourth recommendation is to ensure that the process for countersigning of all SFO reviews is sufficiently robust to meet the required standard, and that regional senior leaders are held to account for the quality and timeliness of SFO reviews. Can I just go back, Lou, to the one before? Thank you. Gather evidence that action plans are always being implemented. As we've mentioned earlier, we have had a focus on those. So we're making a recommendation to consider learning from SFO reviews, and that recurring and thematic learning is identified to make improvements to practice, and that updates to action plans sufficiently reflect the progress and impact made. Thank you. And the final two recommendations are to implement changes to ensure that all SFO reviews are timely and completed to a sufficient standard, and to monitor and publish information on completion of overdue SFO reviews, including the size of the backlog and the progress made and the quality of reviews completed against standards. We are aware that there have already been changes made, and there is a process that's been implemented in October to address the backlog of SFO reviews. So we've been working already with HMPPS to look at how that's implemented and to monitor that. So that is already underway, and obviously forms part of these recommendations as well. Thank you. And finally, this is what Martin had to a comment that Martin made in the report, urging HMPPS to consider those recommendations to take forward. And that concludes our presentation. So I think now we're going to consider questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that sort of comprehensive overview of our findings in our annual report this year. I'm happy to take any questions. Now, there was a Q&A chat function running if people want to put any questions in the chat, and then we can take those. But if not, if anybody wants to raise their hand, we can hear your questions directly, and then we'll work out who's best placed to answer those questions. I mean, one reflection I would make, having sort of gone through these findings, I think we need to be clear, don't we? You know, the work of the probation service involves managing a huge number of people, will often have complex needs. Many, of course, may have committed serious offences in the past. Risk cannot be eliminated when you're managing it in the community. It has to be managed, it has to be mitigated. So there's no way you can eliminate SFOs, but I do think it's really important, and I say this as somebody that was formerly chief executive of the parole board, where the parole board released people and serious further offences occurred thereafter. I do think we need to enter this in a spirit that we seek to identify learning wherever we possibly can and ensure we provide that transparent, humane communication to victims in relation to understanding what may have gone wrong and moving thereafter. I see Andrew Bridges has raised his hand. So Andrew, we hear from you any observations or any questions from you?
Well, I wasn't going to ask the question because I realise that the topic that interests me isn't directly related to the specific report. So if there are other people who want to ask about the specific report, I would give them priority. But because you've got
the floor, Andrew, so go for it.
You've opened the subject about what counts as doing it properly, and I do think, as you're only too well aware, that it's always possible after the event to identify ways in which work could have been done better. And of course, it's right that we should all want to strive for high standards. And I have to say, it does come over even in the report that we have heard today. If we're not careful, we always seem to be saying this SFO wouldn't have happened if everything had been done properly. Now, as you've just said, Martin, we don't actually mean that. The inspectorate still rightly says that you're not looking for perfection. It doesn't look as if that's what it is. And you can hear that with the fact that for very, very understandable reasons, victims want to hear an apology. But, is an apology always appropriate? I mean, if the doers of this world, the people who actually do the work, are not going to be on a hiding to nothing for every SFO review, then do you think it might be possible for SFO reviewers, and that therefore means inspectors as well, to be able to say in appropriate cases something like, in this case, all reasonable action was taken to contain this person's risk of harm to others, or people did do their job properly. The public protection work in this case was done well enough. It's that line of sufficiency, because you can't expect perfection, particularly under the circumstances in which probation is currently working. And I ask that as a question because I know only too well that, of course, it's not easy to even consider saying that when someone has just died, and probably quite dreadfully.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll make some observations on that if I can, and then I'll ask the team to sort of come in with any observations, because they're the people that undertake, obviously, the detailed reviews here. I mean, you're absolutely right that ultimately the person that is responsible for committing a serious further offence is the person that perpetrates that offence. Risk cannot be eliminated. The one observation that I've made, and I have said this publicly before, if you look through the lens of our main probation programme inspection, what you see is there is a need across the board for the probation service to look at the quality of work on public protection that's currently taking place on the ground. Now that is due, I'm absolutely sure, to the significant staffing deficit that they're facing, that huge overwhelming caseload in a very difficult, very changeable world, and also the experience that people have as part of that. And I think I'd much rather widen the lens, and we said this in our last annual report, that actually what we should be looking for is system learning rather than individual learning. In my experience, looking at many of these, it's rarely the case that it's the fault of an individual officer that something goes wrong. Generally speaking, the answer is things may get missed because there aren't enough hours in the day when you're managing lots of cases. And I think it's important that we draw a distinction between that. But of course, it's impossible to say with certainty that if a particular action had been taken at a particular point of time, the serious further offence would have been avoided. I mean, the only instance which it could have changed, somebody being not at a particular location on a particular day, was would they have been recalled to custody. But we know that even a recall decision does not necessarily involve immediate recall to custody, because in essence it starts a process in which people may take days, sometimes weeks, to be recalled to custody as well. Just on the question of apologies, what I would say is this, and all of the probation practitioners that I've ever spoken to, when a serious offence occurs, the individual officers concerned are clearly extremely sorry, and sometimes devastated by that. I don't see a reason why the service cannot say that they are sorry that something has occurred, and that is very different, I think, to saying that there is organisational responsibility for that, because sometimes, I mean, we know, actually I know from your work, Andrew, that sometimes somebody will be released from prison to an approved premises, they will leave the approved premises, and something will just happen on the street that day. The probation service isn't responsible for that. You can't control that risk. But sometimes there are instances where the practice could have been improved. And I think it's important that we shine a light on that. What we would ideally want, I think, and the aspiration should be, at the moment, our main probation programme is finding that just over a third of the cases we inspect are sufficient in their public protection work. We need a drive to improve that. So it's the overwhelming majority of cases the practice is good enough. And from that place, I think we'd be much more confident that all that is reasonably practicable is being done as part of that. And of course, if I was a family that had lost a son or a daughter or a father as a result of a serious further offence, nothing is going to put right that harm. But at least we'd be able to explain to them what has happened as part of that. But I don't know whether Simi, Lindsay, Hannah, or Lizzie wanted to make any observations, because you are much more expert in doing this day to day than I am.
That was a really helpful response, Martin. And I think just to add as well, where we do see reviews undertaken well, whilst they may not be the majority, we do recognise where the standard of the reports or the reviews have met the required standard. Both HMIP and HMPPS work against agreed standards and guidance, so there is that consistency across both organisations as well. But we don't just want to identify those where improvements are needed, but actually recognise those that have done really well in terms of the overall sufficiency. Lindsay.
Yeah, I think I would just add, just in relation to the point about apologies and accountability, that what victims told us was often about the disclosure meetings that were undertaken and that sense of accountability, in the respect that it was often perceived as being quite a tick box exercise. There wasn't a lot of genuine sort of attempt to support or acknowledge what had, you know, for that family was a life-defining experience that they would never recover from. And it was things such as, you know, referring to the SFO as a learning curve for the organisation when they're talking about the death of a loved one, and, you know, senior leaders almost attributing blame to the individual practitioners, which victim family members, that, you know, they don't want individual practitioners necessarily to be blamed, because often they understand the context in which they're working. So I think the apology issue, it is also about the delivery in those disclosure meetings and the tone and the manner in which that is undertaken. And it comes back to that bigger point about the humanisation of the victim. And again, it just not being like a procedural formality and that tick box exercise. It just lacks compassion and that human element. That's all I would add.
Thanks, Lindsay. Lucy?
And I was just going to come in on the point about recognising when things have been done as expected. Andrew, I think you mentioned a lot of what we've talked about today has been highlighting where practice has fallen below expected standards or opportunities were missed. But we absolutely do encourage in reviews that where practice has met the expected standard or has been sufficient, that is, of course, noted. And indeed, we have seen some reviews where practically everything was done to manage somebody, but they still, as Martin said, they couldn't mitigate the risk entirely, and the person did go on to commit an SFO. As you've rightly mentioned, that doesn't necessarily provide comfort to the family, of course, in those horrendous circumstances, but does recognise that the service were, on that occasion, doing actually what would have been expected. So we do aim, and the standards that we have for our SFO reviews do aim for that to happen in reviews where that's evident.
Thanks, Lizzie. Extremely helpful. And thanks for the question, Andrew. I think it's a really good challenge. The other thing I'm very conscious, and I know there are lots and lots of probation practitioners on this call, I do think it's important that you hear from me as the current Chief Inspector and from Andrew as the former Chief Inspector of Probation, that we understand the operating context in which you're operating. And ultimately, this point that risk cannot be eliminated, but what of course we all aspire to is to ensure that the risk is managed as well as is possible in the circumstances, and that, you know, things are identified and acted on wherever possible. We're not expecting, it would be unreasonable, particularly as the probation service is currently staffed, to expect perfection, but what we expect is sufficiency in relation to that. The other observation I'd make, and I've worked in the system for well over 30 years now, is many of the issues we see in serious further offence reviews are echoed and would have been points that would have made in Andrew's day as well when he was Chief Inspector of Probation, in relation to issues of information sharing, issues in relation to risk escalating and not being spotted. Those are common things that the system always needs to, I suspect, focus on. And of course, what we seek to aspire to over time is to identify that learning wherever we possibly can. But the reality is, you know, people, you know, 99% of people in prison will be released at some point, and they're released into the management of the probation service, and they have to carry that risk at that point there. So I think it's an important point. I did see a hand come up. It was Glyn Holland, I think. Glyn, welcome to the call.
Hi there. Thank you. Yes, and so I'm a senior manager in the West Midlands and probation, and overseas in the West Midlands. And I think I just wanted to reflect the challenge around the need for detail, but also then the asking from victims and for the information to be clear, focused, and that I think is a challenge for the reviewers, because often the feedback when it comes into and the feedback that they get back either from somebody who is quality assuring the document is that it doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover all aspects of practice and things that could have been done differently or better. And therefore there's a temptation, I think, over time that I've seen for reviews to get longer and more detailed, but then it is then a challenge in making it clear and summarised and for the victim's needs. And I think it's a real challenge that the reviewers have, I think it does account, I have to say, for some of the findings in terms of like the requires improvement scoring, because often in those reviews, the requires improvement comes from wanting some more information. So it might be that 7 or 8 things are covered, but actually there's like 1 or 2 things that aren't, or when they need more detail, but then it just makes it longer and less clear for the victims. So I just think it's a challenge that I just wanted to raise. I think that all of us are facing, like, trying to overcome in the regions.
Lynn, thank you so much for that question. I thought it was absolutely excellent, because I think you absolutely highlight the balancing act that we're all seeking to strike when we're doing this. I absolutely recognise this. The other thing that we've certainly commented on, it's not at all uncommon, and I bring the team in who look at these reviews to find an SFO review that's over 100 pages long in relation to the findings from a particular review, which again then brings in all those questions in relation to, well, it might be, you know, encyclopedic in relation to that, but how accessible is that if you're going to share that with a family? And then to some extent, the other problem I think that we face, and it's the challenge that we need to look at how we address in the future, is of course the people that are undertaking the reviews are probation practitioners. So they are built into the technical detail of risk management, how, for example, assessments are done. Of course, the families that are affected by this don't understand any of that technical detail. Why would they understand the technical detail of how the probation service and risk management and all those sorts of things work? So I think it's an acute challenge. The other thing that I would say, and it'd be easy for me to say this as a chief inspector, wouldn't it, is I think probably more could be done to ensure that there is an accessible summary available to victims that provides the closure. Now, the danger is, and I say this as the former sort of person in charge of the parole board, we produce summaries for people that are interested of parole board decisions. But of course, if you're producing a summary, many people will then say, but what's in the full report? What's in the full decision letter? So to some extent, you're caught between those two stools in relation to, well, there's no right answer. But I wonder whether, you know, a clear, crisp, accessible summary that provides victims with the information that they need. And of course, if you want the more detailed information, maybe that is available with some redactions when necessary, might meet the better need. Because to some extent, I think the problem that we have is we have a system that's trying to do 2 things at once, and it's very hard to reconcile those 2 things, one of which is transparency and information provided to victims versus learning for the organisation, and that's a very different thing. And I think that's part of the issue that we face. But I'll bring the experts in because they may disagree with what I've just said. Lindsay, Hannah, Lizzie, Simi.
I think it's absolutely right to raise that, Glyn, that there is a challenge in getting the detail that is needed in the report, but also making it accessible and not too long. And Martin's right, we do see some extremely lengthy reviews that aren't always necessarily helpful. Equally, we see some lengthy reviews that do have a good level of detail and do capture all the pertinent points. And I think quite often what we feed back on is the need to ensure that the most significant public protection elements of the case are included, and perhaps some of the detail regarding the less significant elements of the case are excluded. And we've always strived to strike that balance, really. And I think it is that balance of explaining it fully. And there is the new backlog approach that I mentioned earlier that HMPPS have introduced is aiming to consider public protection not only the public protection practice, but the significant elements of that had an impact on the management of the case, and produce that summary at the end. And of course, it's very early days as to how that's going. And as I said earlier, we are working with the SFO central team on that. But mainly our feedback will always be to consider the most pertinent issues and do those in a way which can be read both internally but also externally. And of course, that's where the use of the glossary comes in that we mention regularly to try and cover those as well. But equally, it comes back to the delivery of those messages to the families that we've also mentioned. And whilst the full report may be available, it's about how those messages are also delivered, and making sure those key points are captured, and then the detail is there, as Martin said, in the report, should the family wish to read it in full, which obviously some do, as we know from our engagement with them. So I think all of those things are equally as important, but the document in itself should cover the pertinent messages which can then be delivered hopefully in an effective way to the victim or their family.
And just one final point, one of the observations that we made in the report, I do think there's, I mean, what I would also say is balancing this is I do wonder whether there is more we can do to give probation practitioners that may be then doing those disclosure meetings to ensure they have the support, and maybe do some best practice guidance in relation to what would be the best way of doing this. And I think there is an opportunity potentially to engage with families in relation to how we might do these things better, because I completely understand how difficult it must be if you're having to go to a meeting to explain things that may have happened in a particular case where perhaps actually there is significant learning for the organisation as well. I think it's a real opportunity, and I wonder whether maybe the Victims Commissioner may be an area that maybe we can work with the Victims Commissioner with as well. Lindsay, Hannah, any other observations from you or Simi?
Nothing significant to add, just to say, Glyn, that we've started to see some of the backlog templates come through now, yet to look at them in detail, but we're really keen to see how that template transforms the approach to SFO reviews, because what we do know so far is that they are significantly shorter. So yeah, we'll be looking at that with interest really to see how that does impact on it.
Thanks, Hannah. Barty.
Hi, I haven't read
Barty.
the report yet. Hi, it was just feedback. In terms of hearing, you know, just about this, the gradings and the amount of cases that requires improvement. Just if I wasn't in the SFO team, it would give me the impression that these products, these unfinished products, are the ones shared with victims. And I'm not sure how much it goes into in the report, but I guess it'd be good to kind of hear a bit more about the actual finished products, like are reviewing managers taking on board the feedback? Are we producing the right kind of end product?
Great question, Barty. I don't know if anybody on the team wants to pick up that question.
I can come in if you like.
Go on, Lizzie.
Hi, Barty. So that does obviously the figures that we've shown today are the figures, excuse me, when the reviews come in for quality assurance, and those are obviously the ratings that are sent out as part of that quality assurance process. What the report also does talk about is the dip sampling that we do for reviews that receive a requires improvement rating. So periodically we do request reviews to come back in that didn't meet the required standard to check if the required amendments have been made. So that's another element of ensuring that those reviews are then meeting the required standard. But also for those on the call who aren't familiar, when there is a request made by the victim or family to read the review, and if the review didn't meet the required standard, we request that that's resubmitted to us with the amendments for a further quality assurance. So yes, those figures are the first set of figures that go out, but we don't re-rate on resubmitted reviews. What we will comment on is whether we think it's suitable for sharing, but of course that responsibility does fall to the region because it's them sharing the review. So whilst we make recommendations and say what we think needs to be amended for it to meet the required standard, the overall responsibility of that document is the probation region, who will then share the review. So the very final version we won't necessarily see when it's been through redaction, etc. So there is there are a few steps to the process, of course, when a document doesn't meet the required standard.
Yeah, I think, you know, like I'm sure you've had like a million conversations about feedback in QA, and I don't have an issue with the ratings and the feedback that's given. I think sometimes my issue is around the emphasis given as like that final scoring, whereas actually the QA process is collaborative, trying to make sure we get the right end product, and sometimes it doesn't quite feel like that. So that was my only feedback.
Thanks, Barty. I think that's a very good challenge. I mean, generally speaking, and I know I speak for the team here, we very much see that as part of the things. Ultimately, we have the same objective here, which is to ensure that SFO reviews are completed to the right quality and provide what it is that we're aiming for here, which is to provide learning and to provide that transparency. And I very much see this as something where, of course, we all want to work towards that objective, even if, of course, we have to report on what we found as part of that process. But I think it's really important that we have that central focus on the basis that we all want to ensure that we have the appropriate work going forward. Thank you very much for that question. Any further immediate questions?
We have a couple of questions in the chat, Martin, if you're happy to take those.
Oh gosh, see, I've not been looking at the chat. See, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Go on, Louise, take us to the chat.
Thank you. So we have a question from Lois Hamilton. She's asked, was there any identification of the barriers to engagement that victims' families would have wanted to see? And are there any good examples that we could share?
Obviously, the team have done the engagement. I don't know if any of you want to answer any immediate questions on that one. One thing I would say, sort of upfront, is I wonder whether, given the fact that, I mean, you're talking here, I think for the last year, you're talking about 872 notifications against a caseload of 244,000 cases. So the volume is not significant. I wonder whether one of the things that HMPPS could do to provide some greater transparency is just be very clear, have a published policy or statement of, if you are impacted by a serious further offence, what it is that you're entitled to expect to receive as part of that. And I struggle to think where I would currently go as part of that to see that. And I think that's something which maybe we could people could work with victims' families and maybe with the Victims Commission to provide that absolute clarity in relation to what their entitlements are. I think that would help. But any of the guys want to come in relation to that question?
I think I would just add, in relation to the point about barriers to engagement, what several families did talk to us about was about their emotional readiness to engage and how that changes over time. So obviously, reviews are in different regions ready at different stages. Obviously, we know there's been a backlog. We know sometimes victims are waiting protracted periods of time, but there's a question there about when somebody is ready to receive that information, and obviously it should be available in a timely way as and when people want to receive it. But also what people talked to us about was needing time and space to absorb the information when that is actually shared with them. And one of the key things that came up was about the ability to re-engage and have a follow-up. So for some family members, they were promised a follow-up and that follow-up never came. So that was kind of a subsequent barrier after initial engagement. And for others, it was about time to be able to come back and ask questions about the detail of the review, but also just that some people who weren't ready to engage when they were first given that opportunity to receive disclosure, that for some people may change over months, over years. And the question, and this is about the barrier, is about ensuring that that process enables people to re-engage at a future point, and knowing, as Martin's just alluded to, who is it that you then go back to as your single point of contact. And I'll give you an example of a particular family that we engaged with. What they talked to us about was almost a sense of having to cold call a probation office because they didn't have the information, they didn't know where to go to. So calling reception, having to explain to a stranger in a probation reception who you are and why you're calling, and then repeating that. Those things that may seem really minor for a victim's family are absolutely huge. So I think I can only share from my experience of the victims that I've engaged with, but certainly one of the greatest barriers is about awareness of rights, their rights to what they receive and how that contact and when that can take place, and just really that people should have the ability to opt in at a future time and have the right contact details based on their emotional readiness, and because that does change, and that's very much an individual thing. So yeah, that would be a main thing I would share.
Lindsay, that's really, really helpful feedback, and I guess that's the bit for me is, we know, I mean, again, National Office published a report some weeks ago now identifying the significant shortfall in staffing for the probation service front line, and I've been calling on government ministers to obviously increase the number of staff, will be a good thing, but also to ensure that they're focused on where they can most make difference. So the reality is that for serious further offence cases, it's about ensuring that we just make that process as easy as possible so that people can access the information that they need. It's not about pouring, significant extra resources in this. It's to ensure that as far as possible we get it right first time, that we provide that very clear view and we make it easy for them to. And a lot of what we're talking here is more about sort of the sensitivity and sort of thinking about it from how their experience would work, rather than increasing the size of SFO review teams. I think the balance needs to be struck in this, but I think we can, within the resources that we have, do this better than we currently are. And I think one of the ways to do that is speaking to victims about what it is that they need. Thank you very much indeed. I've got another question in the chat, or anybody else wants to raise their hand?
We have another question in the chat from Gareth Aldridge, talking about the language piece, which is asking what term should be used rather than the SFO.
Good question. Anybody got any ideas? I'm happy to take ideas on this one. I mean, you could talk about serious incident. You could do that. Again, one thing to be clear, of course, for many of these are alleged serious further offences. Certainly at the point of notification, it's a little while, and there's a distinction between a proven serious further offence as well. But I don't know, from the team's perspective, I mean, the trouble is, I think serious further offence is certainly widely understood and certainly was used back when Andrew Bridges was chief many years ago now. I don't know if anyone's got any suggestions of other alternative names that we could use, but I think we need to ensure that we keep it simple as far as possible.
I think, Martin, this was in relation to, I think Lindsay's probably going to say the same thing as I am. This was in particular in relation to the description of the incident, the SFO that took place in a particular family's experience, and they were, I think it was probably as well part of one of the messages that we heard in this presentation, and I think it was particularly around the actual point in the review where I'm going to call it the SFO because that's the familiar terminology at the moment, but the SFO was described, and I think it sort of dehumanised what had happened to the family member in that particular case. So I think it's more about the language when describing the offence that's led to the serious further offence, because absolutely take on board that during the course of the review, it would need to be referred to as something for the internal audience as well. But I think it's more about those messages that are being delivered to the victim and family and how that can be addressed. And I think the name wasn't used, and there is again sensitivities around that, which we do acknowledge. So it's about thinking how that's worded when those messages are delivered, I think, as well as what's in the report. If that
Thanks
helps.
for saving me, Lizzie, by explaining and your actual correct reading of the question, which has to be right. Thank you very much indeed.
Unless I've got that wrong, and Gareth will come back, I'm sure. But if that's the question that he was asking.
It feels like it probably was, but Gareth, do come and tell us if not. I mean, the other thing that I wonder here is, you can understand the sensitivity, so using names, for example, as part of that. I wonder whether the answer to this is use it as an opportunity to engage with victims to understand what would be an appropriate thing, because to some extent everybody's different. Some people may be, may find the language very difficult, but maybe there is a room for us to agree some best practice guidance in relation to how do we refer to this when we're providing something to victims' family, to ensure that if you are the person undertaking the disclosure meeting, that there is some some commonly understood approaches that might be better to use in the circumstances. The reality is, of course, that the harm that has been caused would have been caused by the offence itself, and the impact of that on your family. But if we can do anything to ensure that we use the right language, of course, that's something that we should be looked at. Louise, we've got another question from Rachel. Oh, Lindsay,
Yes.
are you going to come in on that question first of all?
I was very quickly just to say there is a section in the annual report, and this speaks to the point about personalisation. So again, this is what I think some people might see as being quite a minor thing, but many victims' families said to us it's about asking the question, how would you like your loved one to be referred to? Just as you've said there, Martin, like in terms of the disclosure meeting, rather than just, victim one, the murder of victim one at the end of a review. It's asking those questions right, in advance of a disclosure. How would you like your loved one to be referred to when we have this discussion, and understanding those sensitivities? But that's definitely something that we have captured in the report, and it's in relation to personalised engagement.
Super. Thank you very much, Lindsay.
We had another question from Rachel Willets in the chat, which is whether we're getting any further in terms of the thinking on how we might constructively gain learning post-sentence from the person who committed the offence, and how much perpetrators know about the SFO process and the disclosure to victims.
Gosh.
Want me to start off with that one, Martin?
Yeah, go on.
So in terms of engaging with the person who's committed the SFO offence, it's something that we have been reflecting on in terms of how we may include that, and certainly something that we've reflected on in terms of our responsibility for independent reviews. We haven't included it in the process just yet, but worth just letting you know that it is something that we are considering. What we're not sure about is the level of engagement that we would get, particularly if there's any element of denial or lack of responsibility. But that said, very helpful prompt for us and something for us to consider. And again, I think you're right in terms of perpetrators not knowing about the SFO process or disclosure to victim. I think Martin covered this earlier, really, in terms of making sure there is a way of making sure that others know about that element of the service and the work that is conducted by the probation service. Don't know if others want to come in and comment on that as well.
Thanks, Amy. Any more for any more on that question? I can see that Andrew has added a comment in relation to the use of the term SFO, which again I think is very useful in relation to just, and I think we can just find ways of expressing it which reflect the gravity of what has happened for quite often people that would not previously have known. Louise, any more final questions? And if not, I was going to bring this event to a close and thank everybody.
We've just got one more question that's been dropped in, if we get just a short one, which is, as SFO teams, we don't have control over how the SFO review is shared with the family. What work will be undertaken with PDUs about this?
Thank you. It's a really, really good question. I've got to say, I think that's primarily for HMPPS to think about how that process should work. Obviously, our team is more than happy to sort of feed in with sort of suggestions and ideas about how to make that worse. And almost that's sort of the theme underpinning this report is, I think, is an area that requires attention. I don't know if any of the team want to come in with any observations.
Yeah, so the recommendations that we've made do ask that HMPPS consider the processes that are in place for sharing and what support and training is provided for those who are sharing reviews. And it'd be interesting to hear as well more about what and we're hoping to discover more about this as we go through any further inspections about who delivers SFO reviews in which region, because we are aware that there may be some differences as well in between how regions approach that, and that can be hopefully something that be considered as part of taking those recommendations forward as well.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Lizzie. Now, I saw Glyn briefly put his hand up, and I don't know if he was put off by me saying that I was about to bring the whole thing to a close. Glyn, you're more than welcome to come off and ask one final question before I close it.
Thanks, Martin. It was just to come back into recommendation 4, I think it was, which was around accountability. And I just wanted to make the observation, certainly from the reviewer's perspective, there is no role in the service, I think, that has their work more scrutinised and accountable than the SFO reviewer. So everything that they do is quality assured by the manager, gets quality assured either by yourselves or the national SFO team, and the results of that feedback are then shared with the regional probation director, senior managers who are not their line managers, and others. So I just wanted to make the point, I think, really, that from the reviewer's point of view, they have lots of accountability and for their work and the work that they do. And as Barty said earlier, the feedback then goes on to lead into changes into with the reviews before it is the final document or it is part of the disclosure into victims. So I do think there's something, and again, I've not got the words in directly in front of me on that accountability, just that I just wanted to recognise and speak up for the level of accountability that the reviewing managers have.
Yeah, thank you, Glyn. I don't really got any immediate observations, but I'll have a little bit of a go of that quickly if I can. I mean, for me, I think the key point is I think you're absolutely right. I think the level of scrutiny around SFO reviews, that I mean, there's a very complicated process in relation to how does it go up the line as part of this. I mean, I guess the reflection that I would have on this, and we pick it up sometimes in our regional inspection reports, is this point in relation to SFO learning, and how is it then built in by the region in relation to actually how might we sort of tackle learning as part of that. So I think it's more, for me, probably more around accountability, sort of at the top of the organisation rather than SFO reviewers. But Lindsay, Lizzie, Simi, Hannah, what do you think? Good question.
Yeah, just to agree with you, Martin, it's very much around regional accountability, particularly around timeliness, Glyn. So knowing that there's the backlog that's been in place, so it's that higher level oversight of not just quality but also timeliness. But recognise what you're saying in terms of the review manager's role. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I'm certainly, my thinking as chief inspector is we need to talk about organisational responsibility, learning and accountability rather than individual learning. I'm sure that's a better way for us all overall, is to look at, okay, then what can HMPPS, what can a probation region learn from this, rather than probation officer one who has happened to be managing this case at a particular point in time. I think it's the wrong way round. Wherever possible, we should be looking to build it up, and then ultimately, up to, how is the probation service resourced, the decisions that are made at that level. Because the one thing that I'm very keen on, and I will close at this point, is ultimately, we need to give the probation service a chance of succeeding. At the moment, it would be fair to say that we are asking a huge amount from our probation service, and anything we can do to ensure that we enable it to get better outcomes in the long term has significant benefits, both in terms of turning people's lives around, reducing reoffending, and better outcomes in relation to serious further offences as well. So I think looking at that sort of much bigger picture, I think it is a really important one. But of course, serious further offences give us some indication of what those sort of underpinning issues are. But thank you very much for a very, very full Q&A session for this launch event. It will be available, as we've said, thereafter. So if anybody joined the call late, they can hear those findings. And I do urge people to have a look at the report, which obviously covers these things in great detail. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope you all have a very good Christmas when it finally arrives. But thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.